everyone. Welcome to the Katie Halper Show live stream. We're going to get started in a few seconds, but for now, just sit tight, and then, yeah, it's going to be great. Let's see. This is... meditation is locked, but luckily... Okay, that's the correct way.
Oh, that's...
It's okay, the orientation is locked. Mine is screaming. Yes. Don't say anything too incriminating because
Yeah, we're filming.
We're filming. But anyway, I love the Pope actually.
We're part of the Jews for the Pope.
I'm a total Jew for Jesus, yeah. Can you move to the left 1 second? I'm just trying to see. How's this? I think it's okay. Now I just need to plug this in. Oh no. It's gonna make it? Let's see. Sorry. It'll just make it. Okay. How's that look? I may ask you to just play with it when I'm up there. Okay, I think that's good.
It's good? Okay. We also, just in case, we do have another stand. But this seems like it's working.
talking to sleep. Scary.
Talk among yourselves.
Or somebody want to come up and say, so scary.
You do that. Carmen, you want to do some Christmas now? You know Medea, don't you? Carmen,
Favorite Christmas movie? John Lennon and Senseless Conflict.
That's the only
Talk or sing or tell jokes or something. Some protesters in here.
No, we're not protesting this.
I've been arrested with 2 people in the front row.
The whole front row, right? The whole front row.
Maybe 3, maybe.
In most of the talks I give, people cannot sit in front of me. Especially in classrooms.
I'm Zool.
Hi, I'm Nick.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Do we need these mics?
It's better to get it.
Okay. All right, cool.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Katie Halper. I'm the host of the Katie Halper Show and Useful Idiots. And I'm really honored to be here today for this really important discussion about the war in Ukraine, making sense of a senseless conflict. And we have the 2 authors, very excited to have them here. So we're talking to, she needs no introduction, but just to technically introduce her. She's a co-founder of CODEPINK and the Fair Trade Advocacy Group Global Exchange. She's the author of Drone Warfare by Or Books. And also thank you so much for Or Books for putting this together, for existing. Thank you, Tom Robinson. So she's the author of Drone Warfare, which is another Or Books book, Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, also Or Books, and Inside Iran, also, say it with me now, Or Books. In 2012, she was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation's Peace Prize. She's also the recipient of the 2014 Gandhi Peace Award and the 2010 Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. She's a mother and grandmother and currently lives in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Medea. J.S. Davies, the co-author of this book, is also the author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. He's written extensively for Huffington Post, Alternate, Consortium News, Common Dreams, Salon, The Progressive, and Foreign Policy in Focus. So welcome, Nicolas. And Aaron Maté is the host of the Grayzone's Pushback. He's also the co-host of Useful Idiots with me. You can find his writing at matte.substack.com, and he's the author of a forthcoming book on Russiagate and the war in Ukraine. So thank you so much for coming. I want to start with you, Nicolas and Medea. What made you write this book? Did you have an aha moment? Was there some piece of news that was particularly terrible? Was there some analysis that was particularly disturbing?
I think the aha moment is when we got a message from Colin at our books.
Oh.
But we had been writing about this for a while, and I hate to say it, but the article we wrote right before the invasion laid out 3 scenarios, the most unlikely scenario being a Russian invasion. And so we really had to go back and look at what we had been talking about and get in more depth. And then when we had the opportunity to write something, I don't know about you, but I think we both put aside everything else, including our partners, and we should thank them, to really write this in record time.
That's okay.
Okay, well,
Move on.
is there something that stands out for you that was a particularly bad analysis or a particularly bad moment?
Well, just the invasion. I mean, it was really a shock to see after 25 years of writing about America's serial aggression in country after country, to actually see Russia chuck out the UN Charter and join in was it was shocking, and took I would say for me it took quite a bit to really get my head around that and try to make some sense of it.
And Aaron, you did not write this book, but we're still happy to have you here. And you write about this topic a lot. What to you do you think is the most urgent matter when it comes to the coverage, the media coverage of this conflict?
Well, it's just striking that, like every other major story of significance, especially when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, the basic factual background is vetoed. You just can't read about it. In U.S. establishment media, you can kind of talk about the issue of NATO expansion. That's the one issue that helped lead to this crisis that you're allowed to somewhat discuss. But otherwise, you can't discuss all the issues, and that makes people like us who are trying to bring the factual background to light our job more difficult, because we need at least like a couple of minutes to lay out the story, because there's so many issues that fueled this war. The conventional narrative is that Putin is an imperialist who wants to swallow up Ukraine, and he invaded Ukraine. The invasion's illegal. You can say that in less than 10 seconds. We need at least a few minutes to talk about not just the expansion of NATO, which begins with the end of the Soviet Union, and you have the promise made to Gorbachev, and there's some dispute among historians as to what exactly Gorbachev was promised, and people who support the pro-NATO line will say, well, there's no formal treaty, so we never promised Russia anything, so we wouldn't expand NATO to the east. But you look at the archives, and they've been released, and it's a pretty clear pattern of Gorbachev being promised that if he allows Germany to be reunified, which is a big concession for Russia, because that Germany was the basis for the Soviet Union losing millions of people in the Second World War. If you allow that, we won't expand NATO 1 more inch to the east. And you had, even if that didn't happen, you've had eminent U.S. diplomats like George Kennan warning for years that this is a major provocation toward Russia. Bill Burns, the current director of the CIA, he warned that when he was Bush's ambassador to Moscow. Fiona Hill, White House expert, warned Bush against that. And Ukraine was promised NATO membership, and that set off a series of events which leads us to the next major issue, the coup in 2014, which you cannot talk about in the US media. We don't know yet the full extent of the U.S. role, as you acknowledge in your book, and we might not know for many, many years. But we know for a fact that the U.S. backed the overthrow of the government in 2014. And that government came in and was very hostile towards the ethnic Russian population of Ukraine, banned their language, encouraged assaults against them, including the massacre in Odessa in May 2014, where dozens of ethnic Russians protesting the coup were burned alive. And you can't get into that background. And the Minsk Accords, but we can talk about all this, but the point is it takes a while to explain all this. And then you have, and let me just jump also to this issue, because this one never gets discussed. For the last 20 years, you had the slow eradication of arms control, led by the US. John Bolton, this was his baby. He came in, and him and Bush destroyed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And that allowed the US to place missiles in Poland and Romania, which they said were aimed at defending Europe from Iran, right? Which everyone knows is a joke. Iran can't even hit Europe with its missiles, and if it did, it would be suicidal. So everyone knows that's a joke. The real reason, as is quietly acknowledged, is that putting these missile sites in Poland and Romania gives the US more leverage over Russia. It can hit Russia a lot quicker than Russia can hit the US, because Russia doesn't have missile sites in Canada or Mexico. And then you have, fast forward to the Trump administration, Bolton comes back in, and he accomplishes the next item on his checklist, which is to kill the INF Treaty, which allows for the redeployment of a whole new class, or with a whole class of weapons that had previously been banned. And immediately, the Trump administration tests one of these weapons in a clear signal to Russia. And that was one of the issues that Russia tried to address when it released a draft treaty just a few months before it invaded back in December 2021, which of course the US administration refused to seriously discuss, except for on a few small issues. So anyway, the point is, all that background you cannot get into, which makes having a reasonable discussion very, very difficult.
Can I just add to that? You can't get into it also because you can't get on the mainstream corporate news. And that's a huge problem when you can't get people who have a rational opinion and have done their work and written books and have expertise. You can't get on a show where you can reach millions of people. That is extremely problematic. And I had somebody, I was doing a lovely community radio station interview today, and they said, well, how many times have you been on National Public Radio or CNN, Fox, any of these? And I said, actually, the only time on this issue that I've been able to get on television is always non-US. So I've gotten close, I've gotten Canada, which is nice. I've gotten Mexico, which is nice, so sort of making my way. But, it is a real problem, and I'm not just talking about us, I'm talking about all kinds of experts, from Jeffrey Sachs to people like Noam Chomsky, who you never see on the mainstream news, is probably the smartest person in this country.
Yeah, I would add, talking about the difference between Russia and the US in terms of early warning for missile strikes. How many of you understand that the United States has a satellite-based early warning system and Russia does not? And so while if there was a suspected incoming missile strike towards the US, the president would probably have something in the order of half an hour to take a look at it, have all his experts weigh in, and before he actually had to make a decision on Armageddon. President Putin or any president of Russia does not have that benefit. They have ground-based radars, and according to Theodore Postol and other people who write in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, yeah, he might have maybe 15 minutes. On the other hand, if the US actually put nuclear missiles in those installations in Poland and Russia, Poland and Romania, which are even closer, that might reduce the decision time in Moscow to something in the order of 7 to 8 minutes. So the whole, as Aaron said, there were really sort of endless warnings to first President Clinton and other successive administrations about the dangers of NATO expansion. So for anyone to suggest that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia, I mean, the obvious response to that is, well, why would that not be a threat to Russia? NATO has been essentially a hostile, aggressive alliance that illegally attacked and invaded Serbia to annex a NATO protectorate in Kosovo. It played a big role in the US disastrous war in Afghanistan for 20 years, and then an even bigger role in the destruction and destabilization of Libya and Syria in 2011. So, why would Russia not be worried about having this absolutely, really the most destructive, potentially destructive military alliance in history, gradually encroaching and encircling it?
There seems to be a consensus among much of the left, or I should say actually not among much of the left, among much of the left who's critical of the role of the United States in this conflict, that Russia was not justified, but was not unprovoked. So Russia was not justified, but also it's understandable and they were provoked. Is that something that represents your view?
Well, that's certainly what represents our view in the book, and we go through in great detail the issue of the provocations. I do think it's important to recognize, and maybe we should see a show of hands of people who have had very heated conversations with people that you consider your colleagues on the left on this issue.
You used to consider them colleagues.
Yeah. So, there is no consensus on the left on this issue, and it's made it very difficult to build some kind of real movement around this, which I hope we will talk about more tonight, but to recognize that's why we thought this book is so important, and we've been going around the country giving talks on this book, and it's been really interesting to see the reaction from audiences, because sometimes they are sympathetic audiences that really want to delve into the issue so that they're better prepared to talk to their friends and colleagues about this. They're buying books in great quantities, we're happy to say, especially in this holiday season. They say it's the gift my relative might not have wanted, but it's the gift they're going to get. But then, we have also had very hostile experiences with people doing what CODEPINK is so good at doing, coming up and grabbing the mic. And so it's a very, very, very contentious issue. I think as the war drags on and more people become convinced that what they hear in the mainstream media is just not the rational discussion of this issue, i.e. that there is a victory there around the corner for Ukraine, which is going to get back all of the Donbass and even Crimea, the more this it becomes clear to people. And thank goodness, it's not just people like us, but it's also the chair of the Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, who is now saying time for negotiations because a victory on the battlefield does not look like it's forthcoming. I think we will get more and more of those people that we've had hard discussions with to be on our side, but it's going to take a lot of work to educate them.
On this question of whether the war was justified, and I said from the start that I don't think Russia was justified, but I'm open to the argument. I think war is a crime, and I think to justify a war, you have to show that you've exhausted all diplomatic options. And although I totally think Russia was provoked, I don't think Russia's made the case that they exhausted all diplomatic options. But I'm open to it, given the background. You have the fact that there was an 8-year war raging in the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine. It started with the US-backed coup in 2014. There was something called the Minsk Accords, reached in 2015, which was the agreed-upon formula to end that war. The basic bargain was that the ethnic Russian regions of Ukraine in the Donbass would receive some limited autonomy, basically having their rights respected, so no longer having their language banned, among other things. And in exchange, they would demilitarize, and that would end the war. And you guys talk about this in your book, that there was a whole series of steps that had to happen for Minsk to be implemented. And you can blame both sides, they didn't fulfill all their obligations, but the main onus was on Ukraine to withdraw pull back its forces, have a constitutional change, and allow for some local elections. And that never happened. Ukraine dragged its feet. Zelensky was elected on a platform to basically make peace to end that war, and he saw what happened. He faced threats from the far right, who threatened to kill him if he implemented Minsk, because for the far right of Ukraine, which is a problem in this country we can't talk about, at least during the invasion. Before the invasion we could talk about the Azov Battalion being neo-Nazi. Now they're, according to the New York Times, a celebrated Azov Battalion, no longer neo-Nazi. But they played a
They
huge
read
role.
Robin, they must have read
They
Robin. What's her name?
read White Fragility by Robin.
Yeah, Robin
Yes,
book, so
They
they're
transformed.
They're sensitive now.
While fighting off the Russian invaders, they also read White Fragility and became anti-racist all of a sudden.
Yeah.
But so you could, so they intimidated Zelensky into not following through and making peace, and that's why right before the invasion, Zelensky refused to even speak to the rebel leaders, refused to even talk to them. If you won't talk to them, how will you make peace with them? So that was, that for Russia was in a very, very tough position, because it was clear that Ukraine was dragging its feet, and Ukraine's far right was aided by the US, which put no pressure on Zelensky at all, didn't have his back at all, and he was trying to take some steps towards implementing Minsk. So you have that. Then you have the fact that the US refused to discuss Russia's core grievances. So in December 2021, Russia submits these detailed draft treaties to the US and NATO. And the US responds by saying, okay, we'll talk to you a little bit about the placement of missiles, but on the core issue, for example, of Ukraine joining NATO, we won't even talk to you about that. Derek Chalet, who's a top State Department official, he said this in an interview he gave after the invasion. He was asked if NATO expansion was even on the table in their discussions with Russia. He said it wasn't. He said that we made clear, quote, to the Russians that we were willing to talk to them on issues that we thought were genuine concerns they have that were legitimate in some way, but such as arms control. When it comes to NATO, that was, in the view of the White House, not legitimate, so therefore it couldn't even be discussed. So you have a refusal to implement the Minsk Accords, a refusal by the White House to even talk about the core issue for Russia of Ukraine's membership in NATO, which, by the way, Charles Kupchin, who's a former senior official under Obama, recently wrote in the New York Times that for Russia, that's an existential threat. We have to take that seriously. Macron said the same thing. But for establishment U.S. media, we can't have that thought yet. We're not allowed to. So you have that. And then recently you have someone like Angela Merkel, who brokered Minsk, the former German chancellor. And she recently gave an interview, I think last week, very recently. She said that Minsk was just meant to give Ukraine time. She said it wasn't meant to make peace, it was to give Ukraine time, and the time we bought Ukraine through Minsk allowed them to build up their military to prepare for war. And she said that back then NATO would not have given Ukraine the support that we're giving to them now. So Merkel, if you read between the lines, was basically saying that Minsk was a fraud, that there was no intention to make peace at all, end the war in the Donbass, and it was just used to stall for time to prepare for a war that we're having now. So Russia can look at that and say, on what basis then can we negotiate with these people, and what alternative do we have? I still think Russia could have exhausted other options. For example, why not try to get a UN peacekeeping force to go into the Donbass? I'm sure the US would have vetoed that, but why not at least try? I think you have to exhaust all diplomatic avenues. But I'm not going to pretend that Russia wasn't provoked, and I'm not going to pretend that they were not put in a very, very tough position, given the admitted deceptions from some of the key players involved, including Angela Merkel joining that club.
And actually, the way Angela Merkel ended that statement was to say, can anyone tell me, how can Russia ever trust the West again? How can they ever commit to a possible future peace agreement? I would say they can't. And that's so that's not us drawing
She
that
said that, really?
Yeah, she
I
did.
missed that. Wow.
That was exactly, that's word for word what she said. Yeah.
Wow.
And that's
Okay.
an interview with Die Zeit on December the 7th. And of course, what we hear from a lot of people is, but you can't, how can you negotiate with Russia? That was one of the things on the flyer here, the questions. does calling for a negotiated settlement mean offering support to Putin? And of course, the danger with any negotiated ceasefire is always that the enemy will use that time to build up and strengthen their forces in order to recommence hostilities at a later date, which is what Merkel has now admitted the West did to Russia and to the people in Donbass and Crimea in 2015 in the Minsk Accord. And so, but the answer to that, I would say, is that that is why a negotiated peace and a ceasefire agreement actually have to be comprehensive, and they have to be genuine. I mean, you really have to put everything on the table and address the interests of both or all sides, or you risk ending up in that situation. And yet, in spite of all of that, in spite of those risks, and in spite of the absolute betrayal that really was, the Western role in the Minsk Accords, what actually happened as soon as Russia did invade Ukraine? Within that first month of the war, they went to the negotiating table in Ankara, with Turkey mediating and some help from Israel as well. And in fact, Russia was willing to withdraw from Ukraine, really on one main condition, which was simply that Ukraine give up its ambition to join NATO. And they were close enough to an agreement. The Financial Times, broke this story that there was a 15-point framework for an agreement. On March the 27th, President Zelensky did a national TV broadcast in Ukraine about what he referred to as the neutrality agreement. He he promised his people that he would not, give away anything they wouldn't want him to give away. He laid out what his red lines were for the negotiations, and he promised that the neutrality agreement would be submitted to a national referendum in Ukraine before it could take effect. So, how did the West respond to that? On April the 9th, Boris Johnson, the since disgraced Prime Minister of the UK, flew to Kiev, and he told Zelensky, this is according to several of Zelensky's closest advisors who spoke to Pravda Ukrainska, that Johnson told him to stop talking to Putin, stop talking to the Russians, and concentrate on defeating them, that the UK was in it for the long run, and essentially what it came down to was that Ukraine was looking to other countries to provide some kind of security guarantees, to give it some assurance of security without NATO, without this ambition to join NATO, which of course NATO has strung it along for years and years without ever actually letting it join the alliance. But when Johnson refused to be any part of that agreement, he said, you can make an agreement with Russia, but we want no part of it. In other words, we won't provide the security guarantees that might back you up and support you to actually make this peace agreement and get the Russian invaders out of your country. So in effect, and of course Austin showed up in Kiev a little bit later and said that the goal of the war was now to weaken Russia. Essentially, the West saw that Russia was not as militarily strong as they had expected, and so they wanted to make the most of it. Johnson reportedly told Zelensky that we see an opportunity to press Russia and we want to make the most of it. So, as in effect, the message from the West to Zelensky at that point was, yes, you have our full support if you are willing to see your country destroyed in a years-long war to accomplish our goal of weakening Russia. But on the other hand, we will not support you to bring this war to an end and restore peace to your country, which is what Zelensky had just promised his people he would try to do in that TV broadcast.
And try to find a mention of this episode in U.S. establishment media. You just won't find it. There's no reporting on the Western role in sabotaging that peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. It's vetoed. Even when Fiona Hill, the former White House expert, months later, in August or September of this year, wrote in Foreign Affairs that according to her sources, U.S. officials knew that there was a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. She didn't add any further details. She didn't say what happened to that peace agreement, who might have sabotaged it, but she just confirmed that U.S. officials knew there was a peace agreement. There was no follow-up. No one asked, hey, did you know? Well, actually, I asked, I should say. I asked the State Department and the National Security Council, and they gave me a vague non-answer about what happened. So it's pretty clear what happened, which is that the U.S. sabotaged peace talks, or a peace agreement that could have made, that could have put this war to an end in the early months and avoided so much of the destruction that has followed, which was fully anticipated. Back in September, the New York Times reported that according to Western officials, they fear the worst is yet to come. And in fact, they said they were, quote, baffled. That was the wording of the Times. Western officials were baffled because Russia at that point had avoided targeting civilian infrastructure inside Ukraine, and they feared that the worst was yet to come. That's exactly what's happened. Now finally Russia is hitting civilian infrastructure just as winter is beginning.
Which is why I think one of the reasons that the kind of demonization or Hitlerization of Putin is so irresponsible, because it suggested that he was doing the very worst of everything, and it was as bad as it was ever going to get. And because of that, there was really no incentive to negotiate with him. But that's another question, the danger of the Hitlerization of Putin. Medea, I saw you.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you put it out that this is a guy who's like Hitler, this is a guy you can't talk to, I see this a lot when we go out and speak, people just pop up and say, but you can't talk to Putin and you can't believe anything they're going to say. And I think it's important to give some examples of talks that have been going on, not on the broader issue of ending the war, but on smaller issues that have been successful. For example, the grain deal. That has been going on between Ukraine and Russia, not only to get the grain out of Ukraine with a land corridor and a sea corridor, but also to get the fertilizers out of Russia that are so important for the entire world community, especially in the global south. And there are over 10 million tons of grain that have gotten out because of that agreement. There's also the agreement in the Zaporizhia nuclear plant when it looked like several months ago that place was going to explode. And getting in the International Atomic Energy Association into that plant, calming some of those tensions, that was because of negotiations. And then this issue of prisoner swaps. We just heard now about the prisoner swap with Brittany Griner, but there have been numerous prisoner swaps between Ukraine and Russia that have been going on constantly. In fact, probably about twice a month, every single month. And that takes a lot of negotiating and a lot of trust building to happen. So it's important to point out that there are talks that are happening now when it comes to the U.S. talking to Russia, which is another level at which talks do have to happen. We haven't had our president talking to Putin, and we haven't had Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, who's supposed to be our #1 diplomat in this country, talking to his counterpart. But we have had the head of the National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense, and the head of the CIA talking to their counterparts precisely because they are so terrified of this war expanding beyond the borders of Ukraine, becoming a World War III, becoming a nuclear war. And that's why those people are talking. But what we need to do is get the people who can actually talk about a peace deal to be the ones who are talking to their counterparts.
Since they wrote the book, so let's give each of them, we can share a mic.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I wanted to know what you say to the very common refrain, and understandable refrain, when people say, don't Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves? How do you respond to that plea?
Well, I would say the initial impulse to help Ukraine defend itself was understandable, but we have to put that in the context of these negotiations that were taking place in March, because to be willing to arm Ukraine, which is, you know, inherently escalatory in terms of the war. I mean, in many other cases of war around the world, the US and the EU and even the UN have put arms embargoes in place, because it's just a truism that to send weapons into a war is going to lead to more violence and more death and more destruction. And all of this death and destruction is taking place in Ukraine. I think the issue of sending arms has to be linked to the question of peace negotiations and the fact that Ukraine was ready to negotiate peace, and we went quite a long way towards an actual agreement. So we really have to say, how cynical is this, that the US and NATO are willing to support Ukraine on condition that we're supporting Ukraine to keep prolonging and escalating a war on its own soil. And I think that the dangers of this are simply incredible. One of the interesting features of what's going on in terms of the disagreements among US and Western officials is that while we have the US State Department, as Medea said, actually not doing its job, not doing diplomacy, simply doing propaganda and sort of, you know, trying to keep the war alliance together, we have, throughout this war, we have actually had the US military and the Defense Intelligence Agency acting to try and reel in the overblown propaganda and restore some kind of reality check to the media coverage. So on March 22nd, Bill Larkin, the former Washington Post Pentagon correspondent, got a call from the Defense Intelligence Agency, who were authorized to tell him a number of their presumably otherwise secret assessments about the nature of the war. And this was all published in Newsweek on, I think, March 22nd. And so they told him that they had seen no evidence so far at that point of Russia deliberately targeting civilians. Also, they told him that in the first 24 days of the war, Russia had dropped fewer bombs and missiles on Ukraine than the United States had dropped on Iraq in the first 24 hours of that war in 2003. They said that in the Russian offensive towards Kiev, it had actually only destroyed or damaged at that point 55 buildings and killed less than 300 people. I mean, for any of us that studied the US wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the subsequent war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, I mean, this is just astonishing. You know, and now since General Surovikin took over the command of the Russian forces in October, yes, they are now demolishing Ukraine's electric infrastructure, as the US did at the very beginning of both these wars on Iraq in 1991 and 2003. And so then we have in May an editorial by the editorial board of the New York Times sticking its neck out in a way that I don't think it possibly would have done without confirmation from the Pentagon, and they confronted Biden with a number of questions about what the goal of the war was now for the US, and they said what I don't think anyone in the US media or political establishment had said before that, which was that the goal of recovering all of Donbass and Crimea is not a realistic goal for Ukraine. And now, of course, several months later, we have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sticking his neck out, speaking to the Economic Club of New York and saying exactly that. And saying that if there is now a chance for negotiations, a chance for peace, we must seize it.
So, is this an argument that you've been able to reach people with? I mean, sometimes when I'm talking about this and people bring up the right to self-defense, or what about the Ukrainian civilians, I try to focus on the fact that if the West really cared about Ukrainian civilians, they wouldn't sabotage peace talks. Is this an argument that you've been able to convert people with? And if not, what are some of the arguments you've been able to reach people with?
Well, I think the public opinion, despite the disservice that the media is doing and the censorship in the mainstream media, public opinion is changing. And we see that particularly among Republicans, because there's more discussion there because there's a Democrat in the White House. But it's also happening within Democrats and independents as well. And as time goes by, people are starting to question. And unfortunately for us, for the American people, foreign policy is like barely appears in their list of things that they care about. And so when the midterms came, it was hardly an issue. But as time goes by, they do start connecting these billions, which will be, once the passage of this $38 billion package is done, over $100 billion in less than a year, people start questioning, is this a good use of our funds? And that does this affect the inflation that is affecting me in the grocery store and at the fuel pump and in my energy bills? And this is happening even more so in Europe, where the inflation is just through the roof. And we see major demonstrations happening in European countries, including left and right coming together in some of those demonstrations. Here in the United States, we're still trying very hard to build up opposition and have it be visible in the streets and have it be visible to members of Congress. But that is starting to happen. And I think the arguments that work best for the American people are that it's not in our interest. And the arguments that some of the more extreme Republicans have been saying, which is something that resonates with a lot of progressives, there are a lot of unmet needs here at home that need to be addressed. And another argument that I find very convincing, especially when I talk to young people, because when you talk to an older crowd, you can talk about the danger, the real danger of a nuclear war, which could annihilate all of us on this planet. But when you talk to younger people, they don't have that same kind of resonance with that. But what they do care about is the climate crisis and the future of this planet. And so when you talk about all of the connections of this war with the climate, and there are so many, the destruction of Ukraine's environment to begin with, the use of the militarization of Europe and the United States with all this new production of weapons that is so energy intensive, and the use of those weapons, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, which is something the mainstream media will not talk about who really did it, or at least who has motive to do it. And the tremendous methane gas emissions, in fact the largest that we have ever recorded. And on top of that, the potential for the blowing up of the largest nuclear plant in Europe. And adding to that is this issue of where is our money going? Because when we have the COP27 and there's a promise that has never been fulfilled of putting significant money, in fact it was supposed to be $100 billion into a fund to mitigate the climate crisis in the global south, people who are not responsible for the crisis but are the victims of it. That money has never been there, and yet we are showing the world that we could spend over $100 billion in less than a year on an endless war that's not winnable. So that is an argument that wins a lot of young people over, is that we have to put our resources, and that we'll never have an ability to really address the climate if we can't talk to Russia, we can't talk to China, we can't talk to the large countries that are just right now saying, we don't want to take sides, we want to see you end this war. And that's, I think, a very convincing argument.
Can I say on the question of Ukraine defending itself? Of course Ukraine has the right to defend itself. Nobody questions that. Of course they do. They were invaded, they have every right to fight back. That doesn't translate, though, into an obligation that we arm them. As outsiders, our obligation is to do all we can to achieve peace and maximize human life, prioritize human life. And the best thing we can do to achieve peace and save human life is to stop blocking peace and stop using Ukraine as cannon fodder. 2 years before Russia invaded, Adam Schiff got up on the House floor during the first impeachment of Donald Trump and said, the US aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there. We don't have to fight Russia here. Now, of course, there's many things wrong with that statement. The idea that if we didn't use Ukraine to fight Russia, that somehow Russia would be invading the US through California or New York. I don't know how they would enter, but I somehow doubt that would happen. But second of all, it raises the obvious point that if you don't want to see Russia fight Ukraine over there, then don't use Ukraine to fight Russia from here. And that is a thought we're just not allowed to express. So our obligation is not to just automatically arm anyone who is invaded. It's to look at our own role in that conflict and do what we can to end it and try to find a reasonable solution. And this question raises a second point, which is that if you're saying Ukraine has the right to defend itself, well, if you're going to say Ukraine has the right to defend itself, then you're going to apply that equally to all Ukrainians who presumably have equality. And by that line of thinking, then Ukrainians in the east, in the Donbass, who've been under assault for 8 years, have every right to defend themselves as well. There's been a war in Ukraine that we fueled. That's what Adam Schiff was talking about. That's what the war that John McCain and Lindsey Graham went over in 2016 and said Russia has to pay a heavier price. And we've been fueling that war. And on the Donbass side, thousands of people have died. Their homes have been shelled. A lot of civilian lives have been lost. Do they have the right to defend themselves? Do Ukrainians who see things like the massacre in Odessa in May 2014, where dozens of people who were protesting the Maidan coup were burned alive, do they have the right to self-defense? I think they do. But instead of fueling that war and just trying to see one side win, why not do all we can to end that war? And the path to end that war was the Minsk Accords, which, as we've discussed, people like Angela Merkel are now saying that it was never designed to make peace. Although, the counter-argument, I should say, is that Merkel was just saying that now to appease the pro-proxy war crowd, that she was basically trying to compensate for daring to try to make peace. And so now she's claiming she didn't really mean it. That is one possible interpretation. And it's possible because anti-Russia mania is so fervent right now that it's possible that Merkel feels that to give herself some political space, she needs to appease them. So that's possible.
Well, except it really happened.
It did, that's true, yeah.
So yeah, as soon as they sign the accords, the U.S. starts throwing more weapons into the fire. And we went from Obama, who had a ban on lethal weapons, to Trump, who lifted that, and it was a free-for-all. So whether or not she meant what she said, the reality is that the years were used to build up Ukraine. And there was so much surprise in the media that Ukrainians were so good at defending themselves, but anybody who looked at it knew that every year we were training 10,000 Ukrainians. We were putting all of that, those resources in so that they could be able to fight the Russians.
And we never talk about, the Ukrainians. When we talk about we need to defend Ukrainians, we never talk about the inconvenient Ukrainians who don't want to fight, or who have been on the other side of the firing line, on the Donbass side. And I recently learned about someone named Sergei Savoko, who I'd never heard about until I read a new book that just came out by Nicolas, which is called The Tragedy of Ukraine. It's a great book, I really recommend it. And Sergei Savoko was a longtime friend of Zelensky, and Zelensky's actual former comedy producer. And Savoko was a native of the Donbass. And after Zelensky won on that peace mandate, for which he got over 70% of the vote, he appointed his friend, Sergei Savoko, to the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And Savoko unveiled what he called the National Platform for Reconciliation and Unity. He brought this out in March 2020. And the premise was basically to promote dialogue between fighting warring Ukrainians, between the Ukraine government side and the Donbass side. And he unveiled this initiative in Mariupol. But he couldn't even finish his presentation because 20 minutes in, he was attacked by members of the National Corps, which is basically the political group that comes out of the neo-Nazi Azov battalion. So they attacked him on stage, called him a traitor. And what did Zelensky do in response to this? He basically sided with the assailants. He fired his friend Savoko from his position. And the reason I'm telling that story is because these are the kinds of Ukrainians we never hear about. So I never heard about this guy until I read it in Nikolai Petro's book. And we're not allowed to hear about even people close to Zelensky who tried to make peace, who tried to end the war, tried to promote dialogue, but were instead shut down by the far right of their own country, because that's effectively the side we're taking. So when people here talk about we need to stand with Ukrainians, in practice, policy-wise, they mean far-right Ukrainians who won't even tolerate the active dialogue with the non-Ukrainians in the Donbass.
Yeah, one thing that I found doing the research for the book, which I had not seen before, I think illustrates the divided nature of Ukraine leading up to this crisis, and that was a Gallup poll taken across Ukraine 2 months after the coup in 2014. And this was asking not just, do you support your new government? It was asking, do you regard the new government of Ukraine as the legitimate government of Ukraine? And the percent of Ukrainians across the country who agreed with that statement, who said, yes, this is our legitimate government now, was only 51%. And that was a sort of light bulb moment for me, because prior to that time, Ukraine had been very divided between pro-Western politicians and ones who were closer to Russia. Yanukovych had lost an election to Yushchenko, but then Yushchenko appointed him as his prime minister, because he, like every previous president, was by then mired in corruption scandals and losing popularity. And then all of a sudden, Yanukovych is being thrown out, and there is the rise of this far-right Svoboda party, which got actually over 10% of the votes in the parliamentary election in 2012, and it actually got 37% in Lviv province in the west, which was at its base. And so the coup in 2014, which these Ukrainian students who sort of confronted me and disrupted my event at the University of Missouri last week, refer to as the revolution of dignity, and the whole impression that our media give us here in the West is that this was a popular revolution, that Yanukovych did not have the support of Ukrainians at that point. But I think this Gallup poll illustrates just how divided Ukraine was at that point. And another indicator of that is that in the presidential election following the coup in 2014, the leaders of the two largest neo-Nazi groups, the Svoboda Party and Right Sector, who really were the main militia leading the violence of the coup and the battles with police as they tried to march on the parliament. The leaders of those two, Tyanibok, the leader of Svoboda, when he ran for president after the coup, he got 2% of the votes. Dmytro Yarosh, the leader of Right Sector, also ran in that election. He got 1%. So the people of Ukraine rejected that extreme right-wing, white supremacist, neo-Nazi brand of politics. And yet, with the Civil War, those groups found a new role that they were able to play when the Ukrainian military was very reluctant about going and taking back Donbass by force. The new government formed these National Guard units, and really the fiercest among them, and a lot of them, were comprised of these extreme nationalists and neo-Nazis, like as we know now, the Azov Battalion. But and now, of course, since the Russian invasion, most Ukrainians do appear to be strongly anti-Russian. I mean, this is what happens when you invade another country. This is what America found when it invaded Iraq, and ultimately Afghanistan and other countries, Vietnam, throughout all of our recent history. I mean, our leaders don't seem to have learned, but so there is probably more unity among Ukrainians now to resist the Russian invasion. But in the roots of this crisis, Ukraine really was a deeply divided country.
So what can be done now? What kind of activism and organizing is happening and needs to happen?
Well, that to me is the key question, because you have an increasing opposition to this war inside Russia. You have increasing suffering inside Ukraine with the destruction of the infrastructure, and you have increasing opposition from the base within Europe and divisions in Europe itself. Europe that was so united at the beginning of this, and with the US and NATO, a lot of divisions taking place now between the more hawkish countries that are closer to Ukraine and others that feel that they are bearing the brunt of these Western sanctions and don't feel that this makes sense for them. In the United States, what we have is something totally topsy-turvy, and part of it is because there's a Democrat in the White House. But I hope that you remember that fiasco that happened with the 30 members of the Progressive Caucus who put their name on this extremely mild letter that basically was gushing about how great Biden was and how great it was that Congress was giving Ukraine all of this support. But in addition to that, maybe some negotiations would be appropriate. and how they were slammed within 24 hours, and they themselves started pulling their names off, saying, wow, did I really sign that? I didn't mean to sign that, or I signed that when I thought Ukraine was losing, but now Ukraine is winning. And within 24 hours, rescinded that letter that had already been sent to Biden. Quite an extraordinary and disgusting episode. Disgusting that that leaders within the Democratic Party, not the White House, but more like the Nancy Pelosi's, came down like a ton of bricks on them, but also that so many of them started retracting and saying things like, oh, I'm glad that letter's been rescinded, we shouldn't really be calling for negotiations except after victory. In the meantime, not one Democrat opposed the $40 billion package, but 57 Republicans in the House did and 11 in the Senate. And so you now have a situation where I think our obligation as citizens or residents in this country is to put the pressure on both the people who control the purse strings in the Congress, whether they're Democrat or Republican, and the White House itself. And I want to recognize one initiative that I'm very excited about, because I see my colleague Ariel Gold there, who's now the head of Fellowship of Reconciliation, and Ariel and I worked together for many years at CODEPINK, and we have started together with this group called the National Council of Elders, this wonderful campaign to get leaders in the faith-based community to come out calling for a Christmas truce. And when we first started this, we said, let's see if we can get 100 faith-based leaders. And Ariel, how many do we have now?
We are right on the verge of 1,000.
So it's very exciting. They're from all religions, the whole spectrum. And they also are people who have, some of them, access to the White House. Some of them have been at prayer breakfast in the White House or at Biden's inauguration. And they are taking this letter and taking it, asking for a meeting in the White House. And so we're very excited about that initiative because we feel that it takes this issue outside of partisan politics and puts it where it should be. It's a moral imperative to try to stop the killing. And then, yes, clap for that. Another initiative that we are starting really full force in the beginning of the new year is to get the environmental community on board, because when this war first broke out, 200 environmental groups put out a call called Stand With Ukraine, in which they supported the boycott of Russian energy and said that this is a good time to move more quickly towards green energy. It's a good thought, although we did ask them, how come you never boycotted Saudi oil because of the war in Yemen, or how come you didn't boycott US oil during the whole fiasco in Iraq? In any case, we have been talking to them and showing, after now 10 months, and I just came back from Texas where they took me to the places along the Gulf that are being where they are expanding oil production, they're expanding the natural gas production on the justification that we need this to support our brothers and sisters in Europe who are being so hard hit by this Russian energy sanctions. So we are saying to the environmental community, the only thing that has happened in these 10 months is that there is more dirty oil production. There is more firing up of coal plants that had been closed down. There are more nuclear power plants that were going to be decommissioned and now aren't. And so we need to all come together on this issue. And so anybody who wants to help us in this initiative to get the major environmental groups as well as local ones. I was just in San Diego 2 days ago, and they had all of the local environmental groups at the event doing tabling to show how these issues are so connected. And it was the first time in all the events we've had that I've seen that happen, and we have to work for that as we go forward. So I would say reaching out to new communities, because face it, there isn't really an anti-war movement to speak of. We are building it now, And there is a call January 14th here in New York City for a major anti-war protest.
Times Square.
In Times Square at noon. Thank you, Zul. We need lots of people to come out for that here in the city and people who can make their way in. And we will be calling for more activities as we go forward. Where CODEPINK, as part of a women's group, is calling for March 8th, International Women's Day, for women all over the US and Europe and in Russia to stand up and call for negotiations and a ceasefire. And I feel like, well, you should know that there is a growing group called Peace in Ukraine Coalition. You can go onto the website, peaceinukraine.org. You can join the coalition as an individual or a group. You can also go to the CODEPINK website and find out more activities we're doing. We must build up a movement that puts pressure on the White House and on Congress to say, stop the billions of dollars that is only going to prolong this war. Let's push for that ceasefire and negotiations.
Can I say on the Democrats' letter for diplomacy, the retracted letter, what happened, I think 2 weeks later, maybe 3 weeks at the most, that's when, as Medea talked about before, General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's top military officer, came out in favor of diplomacy. Said pretty much exactly what was in the retracted letter. Did any congressional progressive see the opportunity to say, you know, hey, we were right. The top general agrees with us. This is a vindication. No, they just yawned and ignored it.
Right. One Democrat, Ro Khanna, went on CNN and said, of course that letter made a lot of sense. Of course we need negotiations. And he got tremendous support for it. So we have to go back, and we are going back to every one of those who signed on to say, look at Ro Khanna. Look at the support that he is getting. He's even being talked about presidential material now. So we want them to come forward and say, now they could call for a Christmas truce, which is an easy ask. A Hanukkah truce they can call for. But they can also be calling in the new year for a ceasefire and say that, yes, they were right in calling for negotiations.
But I'm sorry to be a Debbie Downer, but even Ro Khanna watered down the content of his own letter while he still defended it. Yes, to his credit, he defended it.
Right.
But he still in the process mischaracterized it, because when he was talking about what the letter said, he said all the letter said was that we were calling for ways to talk to Russia to avoid an escalation. That's how he characterized the letter. That's not what the letter said. The letter talked about finding a way to negotiate an end to the war. So even the most stalwart, the lone defender of the letter among congressional progressives couldn't even characterize it properly because the pro-proxy war pressure is just too strong. That's just the reality we're in.
But he did cite the general.
Good for him. Great.
No,
Good job, bro.
what we were
Sure.
talking
Yeah.
about.
I'm just saying is that
We're not praising him.
I'm commenting on the complete absence of
It's a low
any
bar.
of
Very
any
low bar.
genuine principle in even the congressional progressives like now, and people like Dennis Kucinich, who was staunchly opposed to the Iraq War and did so on principle, and wasn't afraid to stand up on principle. People like that are not there anymore. And that's just the reality
Wait a
we're in.
minute, Dennis Kucinich has been pretty good.
Yeah, that's what I'm
No, he
saying.
means
Oh, he's not there. Oh, he's
politics.
not there in Congress.
Yeah.
But he's been giving talks, and he's been doing a very good job of that. And I just want to mention, I mean, think about how the general came out saying, let's seize the moment, go for negotiations, and he wasn't fired.
Right.
So think about what that means. There are a lot of discussions and divisions in the White House on this issue, and we have to take advantage of that.
So,
And it's worth asking, by the way, why did General Milley say that? Why did he feel compelled to come out in favor of negotiations? Now, one interpretation is that it was all cynical, but there's a good cop, bad cop routine, that to basically continue the proxy war, we need to make it look as if there's some people who are thinking about negotiations, kind of mince the court style, like, oh yeah, maybe we can have peace. That's one interpretation. I think, though, it's because Milley knows where this is going. And we're seeing now new evidence of this, that the U.S., a few months ago, the U.S. was saying that we're not going to give Patriot missiles to Ukraine because that would require sending in U.S. troops to operate those missiles, because it takes like 6 months to train people on how to use them. What are we seeing now? We're sending Patriot missiles to Ukraine, so that's out the window. So we're seeing a creeping escalation, And Milley, I think, realizes that Ukraine doesn't have, despite all the weapons we poured in, doesn't have the weapons it would really need, and would maybe require, and maybe where this is going is forcing NATO to intervene. And Milley, knowing what that would look like, doesn't want to fight that war.
So we're gonna open it up, Colin, right, for questions. We have a mic to put in the audience, but I'm gonna ask a final question. So we hit a lot of the hot topics that were in the flyer, and I don't want to be accused of false advertising. So we did this, does calling for a negotiated settlement mean offering support to Putin? We did that. Should the West be sending arms to a war zone? Basically, I mean, that was not a surprise, we did that. The last two are related, and they're somewhat related to what we're talking about in terms of Ro Khanna being this lone voice. Should progressives make common cause with right-wing anti-war forces, and why is the Western left so divided on the conflict?
Say that again.
Sorry. Should progressives make common cause with right-wing anti-war forces, and why is the Western left so divided on the conflict?
Well, I think we've talked about why the Western left is so divided. In terms of should we make common cause, this is a very contentious issue, even with those who, the small group of us who says, we've got to build the pressure. And my take on this is that we need to be calling on anybody who opposes this war to do whatever they can to reach out to their constituents, their bases, their friends, their neighbors, their colleagues, to put pressure on their members of Congress. Now, their members of Congress might be right-wing, left-wing, well, no, not left-wing, there's nobody left-wing in Congress. Might be Republican, Democrat, or independent, as we have a new senator. So we have to put the pressure on them, no matter who they are. In terms of where we put our energies to build, I've just put out there, build on the interfaith. And past Christmas time, we were just talking about all the faith leaders who we haven't been able to reach, that we should keep pushing on this. We've talked about the need to reach out to this huge and youth-led environmental movement that we have to reach out to. There's the labor movement that in Europe is calling demonstrations and getting people out in the streets. That's a whole constituency that we should put our efforts into building. So, us in the left, we're probably better off putting our energies into building something that is with people that we have a lot in common with, and we can work on other issues together, like the climate crisis. But we should applaud those on the right who are also saying that this war is something that we have to find a solution to. And there is a new term called the New Right, and they are organizing. And these are people who have a non-interventionist approach, who call themselves realists when it comes to foreign policy, and groups like the Quincy Institute are bringing those two sides together, and I think that's very positive.
Colin, how are we doing the mics?
Use the mic there, so I think that'd be the best.
For questions? Okay. Can I say on this issue that, even though Bernie Sanders is in lockstep with neocons like Liz Cheney in fueling a disastrous proxy war that's threatening global annihilation and causing so much suffering, I'd still be willing to align with him in pushing for Medicare for all. So why shouldn't I align with someone who wants to end this war, even if they're on the different side of the political spectrum as me? To me, this question, it presupposes that politics is sort of like a high school situation where you can only hang out with the cool kids. And not with people who maybe you have stuff in common with and have common goals with. So people who support the proxy war, who claim to be on the left, does that mean I'm obligated to support the proxy war too because I claim to be on the left as well? So these labels, I think, don't mean as much as they used to. When you have 0 Democrats willing to vote against funding this war, and that's why I think we should work with anyone willing to stop it, given the consequences.
Yes, but. And the but is that some of the people who are most outspoken, in fact, the person in Congress who is most outspoken on this war is? Marjorie Taylor Greene. Is Marjorie Taylor Greene. And if you don't know who Marjorie Taylor Greene is, you might want to learn a little bit more about her because you might not agree with her on the vast majority of things that you care about. She is the one who put forward a call in the Foreign Affairs Committee for an audit of where this money is going, something that many of us would like to know. She is the one who said during the time of the baby food crisis, how come we can't put baby food on the shelves, but we can send billions of dollars to Ukraine? She gets up on the House floor and talks about this issue. Do people want to be aligned with Marjorie Taylor Greene? It's a question, but I agree with you, Aaron. I think at this point, it's just line up everybody we can in Congress to oppose the next and next and next round of funding that's bound to come if this White House keeps thinking that this war is worth.
And in the Senate, it's Senator Paul.
When Marjorie Taylor Greene had the chance to vote on funding baby formula for low-income mothers, she voted against it. So of course she's a complete hypocrite, and she has said some views that are bigoted. Of course, I'm not advocating supporting her campaign, but what I'm saying is you align on issues, especially when the issues are of existential significance.
Yes.
And this is one of those issues, and so that sort of litmus test of who's left and who's right, I just don't think matters when it comes to issues as important as this.
Okay, so who's gonna, is there an or person who wants to pass the mic around?
Or is there not an or person?
Thank you, Aaron. My question is about the type of warfare, not whether this is a proxy war, but the type of warfare. When the U.S. forces so disastrously exited Afghanistan, President Biden said that we would end the endless wars, but we would maintain over-the-horizon capacity. Military experts at the time said that would mean drone warfare. Folks are now saying that's what takes place in Ukraine now is a totally new type of warfare, that it's drone warfare.
Yeah, well, proxy war is another type of over-the-horizon war, isn't it? And I mean, I think we've seen the evolution of American warfare since the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and essentially it's they have developed these various ways of waging war around the world in a way that generates almost no opposition from the American people, because there are no Americans dying over there, or very few of them, and this is scarily effective, and I think people in the global south are aware of this, because of course these wars are taking place in their countries, across Africa, for instance, So it's a very difficult thing to actually make Americans aware of the fact that they are living in a country at war, when there's no flag draped coffins coming home. And so I think this is a real challenge for all of us who are horrified by these wars, and somehow these are things we need to talk to people about. I would say another thing is this weird schism where we now have the military being the ones who are being the truth tellers and the whistleblowers. Milley's sticking his neck out, and as Medea said, not getting fired for it, but he was then pulled out to do a joint press conference with Austin a week or two later, where he was clearly under pressure to walk back what he had said, and walked it back very slightly, while otherwise basically sticking to his guns, as the saying goes. So, yeah. Yes, and now here we have the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, He just spoke to a broadcaster in Norway, where he is from, and he was asked, what is your greatest fear about how the war in Ukraine will go over this winter? And he said, my greatest fear is that it will spread into a war between NATO and Russia. And he said, if this goes wrong, it will go horribly wrong. And we've had Biden talk about tactical nukes and say that he does not think it is possible to use tactical nukes without it escalating to Armageddon. We have a chapter in our book called Flirting with Nuclear War that Alice Slater of Nuclear Age Peace Foundation helped us with. We can't minimize this. I mean, people who specialize in that area know. I mean, there's so somebody compared it to if I hand you a machine gun with a 100 bullet clip but it only has 5 bullets in it, and I say, well, go on, put it to your head, take a shot. It's only a 5% chance that there'll be a bullet. So it's a very, however small this chance is of nuclear war, the result, if it should come to pass, is existential. It very probably means that it will escalate to Armageddon, and that will be it for all of us. And so, however anyone might evaluate that chance, is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 1%? It is unacceptable, and this entire operation that NATO has waged, expanding to Russia's borders, and all the contributions that our government and Western governments have made to set the stage for and trigger this crisis in Ukraine are all flirting with Armageddon, flirting with nuclear war. And so somehow we have to get this across to people, that this is unacceptable.
You've got 100 seconds to do it.
Yep, and well, they're the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists is already meeting now to discuss where they are going to set the hands of the doomsday clock in their announcement, which I guess will be in January or February. And if they are honest, I think there are more sort of establishment figures on that board for BAS than there used to be, and fewer real anti-war people. But if they are honest, they will tell us, they will tell the world that we are closer to nuclear war than we have ever been before.
I really want to thank Nick and Medea for doing this book, because the voices haven't been out there, as for all the reasons that you put. And I guess I feel very strong that there's people who are thinking it's the weapons manufacturers that are driving this war. Well, they're profiting from it, obviously. I don't think they're driving it. I think it's the whole system right now of imperialist armies, Russia and the US, really trying to figure out how are we going to have supremacy. And China figures in there. This is a world chess game. And I am thinking about an interview that you did with the Progressive Medea, which I thought was really important, where you said, in warfare, the red lines shift. It's always unpredictable in warfare, as we know. A tiny nation can defeat a huge one. And a huge nation can be horribly mired in a long guerrilla war, but we don't know what's going to happen with the nukes. And Nick, your point is so important. I would kind of challenge you though, Medea, on the question of young people not really understanding the danger of nuclear war, because I feel it's our responsibility as at least the generation who has some connection to it. We have to bring this out and really help people understand it's not one side or the other. It is neither of them represent the interests of humanity. And we have to stand up for those and forget about being Americans. It's the interests of humanity that count. And, I'm all for bringing people into the streets on January 14th, Sue. But we've got to do a lot of work across society about this.
Yeah. I think one of the ways to talk to young people about it is the environmental impacts of a nuclear war. What does a nuclear winter look like? So, yes. And then in terms of the weapons manufacturers, it is just astounding how much they are making on this. And when you heard Trump saying, we got to make sure that these NATO countries spend more of their money on the military. They're not pulling their weight. There is this, quote, goal of spending 2% of your GDP, which to people might not sound like a lot, only 2%, but it's a lot. It's a whole GDP. And most of Europe was not meeting that goal. And when this happened, then there was a change, and all of a sudden, countries saying, okay, we're going to spend, like Germany, $100 billion more. And where are they going to buy their weapons? From mostly, not exclusively, but mostly U.S. weapons companies, because they're supposed to be interoperable. Our European allies, who we've been part of a group called Say No to NATO for a long time, have always said, we don't want to reach that 2% goal. You know why? We have national health care. We have free college education for our young people. We don't want to be like you in the United States. And now that's turning it around. And they are complaining in Europe that it's U.S. weapons manufacturers who are the ones that are really profiting from this war, just like it's U.S. energy companies that are selling their energy at 4 times the price in Europe that they're selling it here. So you're absolutely right. We have to educate people about the nuclear weapons issue, and we have to show how the militarization of our society and our globe, because you're right, it's happening in Russia, it's happening now in China, is destroying the planet.
When the U.S. expanded NATO heavily at the end of the 1990s, over the warnings of people like George Kennan, the veteran U.S. diplomat, and others, there was the main vehicle for expanding NATO in Congress, the main lobbying group, was a group called the U.S. Committee to Expand NATO. The president of the group was a guy named Bruce Jackson. That wasn't Bruce Jackson's only job. That was just a part-time thing for him. His main job was as the director of strategic planning for Lockheed Martin. So this Lockheed Martin executive was simultaneously the head of a group called the Committee to Expand NATO, because they stood to make billions of dollars from expanding NATO, and they certainly, as Medea says, profited from this war as well. But I agree with you, it's not just about that. There's a hegemonic imperative here too, and it's great to discuss all these things.
Hi, Medea. Thank you all for this panel. Thank you both for writing this book. I'm excited to read it. I was just wondering, you've spent a lot of time studying this war. What do you think it will take to really end it? Because the task of rebuilding the U.S. anti-war movement, which, as you know, I'm very invested in, and I think what you're saying, bringing in the environmental groups, bringing in the unions, that's rebuilding the faith leadership of that's so crucial, but that's, a decade-long movement to rebuild it back to what what the anti-war movement once was, right? I think, it could, or at least, 5-10 years, it's So what do you see, or maybe do you think that analysis is wrong? Do you think like we can rebuild that mass movement much more quickly?
Yes.
And if good, I like your optimism. And if not, in terms of like ending the war in Ukraine, do you think there's like really some cachet here on the sort of splits in power and in capital, like the military, leaders giving sense, or is it, enough of a push in Europe, these splits in Europe causing real pressure from the EU to not have enough backing for the US? I was just sort of curious, how can we end this particular war soon, and when do you see it happening?
Well, I see the movement calling for negotiations to be just, increasing exponentially. It's just the fact that we got 1,000 faith-based leaders in 2 weeks' time to sign on to this is quite astounding. And the fact that in Europe there are these calls for a Christmas truce that we didn't even know was happening at the same time, and that has caught on all over Europe as well. I mean, so much so that you get Zelensky calling for Christmas truce. I mean, he says Russians all have to leave before we can have this Christmas truce, but he's using the language that we've put out there. And as you said, and we've talked about here, the opposition is growing everywhere. It's growing inside Russia. In Ukraine, we talked about the division in Ukraine, but some polls that have been taken in Ukraine show a growing call for negotiations in Ukraine, and where? In the areas that are most affected by the war. And the areas less affected on the western part, they say, okay, let's keep fighting, but they're not the ones, that are dying in this. So the call is coming from all over, and it's coming globally. This isn't a war that is contained in one place. This is a war that is affecting the world. And Nicolas and I listened to every single speech at the Security Council of the United Nations, the General Assembly. Security Council would be smaller. General Assembly, and found 66 heads of state who used their time to say something to the effect of, we're not taking sides in this, we're taking one side, which is the side of peace, and there's got to be a way to end this. And even at the G20 meeting, where Indonesia was hosting, and used the time to say, there has to be a solution to this. And you're finding the Pope, and you're finding, all kinds of heads of state who are coming forward and saying, enough is enough. This is affecting the entire planet. It's the world of the UN's Food and Agriculture, the World Food Program. They're all coming out and saying how this is increasing hunger by the millions. And so I think the pressure is tremendous. And I think the fact, we keep going back to Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because it's so important to have somebody in the middle of this, in the administration, who's putting that out. Gives a lot of leeway for a lot of other people to take this position as well. I would say in the next 6 months, we're going to be able to build up a tremendous movement, European and in the US, calling for ceasefire negotiations. It doesn't mean I think we're going to stop them from spending our money in Congress. That is going to keep going, and they're the last ones to ever get it.
So, over the last several wars, we've learned that you don't stop wars through abstractions. And I want to thank Medea and the rest of the panel again for laying out particulars about how we can build an anti-war movement. And I'm glad to see you're optimistic, or at least encouraging, because I saw you on a TV webinar where you were a little bit more pessimistic like 8 months ago. But I just want to raise this point, that in my lifetime, not counting the Second World War, during which I was born, the United States has been actively involved in at least 6 major wars that have killed 6 to 8 million people, mostly civilians. And I really don't want to end this war and to have my grandchildren fighting 30 years from now another war. And so I think this question of what kind of a world do we live in and what kind of a society have we as human beings created, and more particularly, what kind of an economic system have we evolved that requires one corporation to kill off another corporation or to merge with it, or one empire to kill off a challenging empire, or the challenging empire to kill off the dominant empire. And I think without those questions and without that context, I'm just really afraid that if we stop this war, my grandchildren will be trying to stop another war 30 or 40 or 20 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, you just said exactly what Martin Luther King said at the Riverside Church in 1967, a year to the day before they killed him. And yeah, this is what we're faced with. And I would say, you know, in talking about the role of the weapons companies and their profits, I think it's important to remember Eisenhower's warning and what he actually said. He said it is the conjunction of a huge military machine and a huge arms industry. So it's the two feed on each other and together because they are each in their own right huge, powerful institutions in our society. When they come together, I mean, that military-industrial complex does amount to possibly the most powerful interest group in this society. And it is very hard to stop it at any stage. It's a self-fulfilling thing, you know, as the saying goes, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Every successive president that comes in is handed, you know, a hammer and nothing else. And supposedly he can deal with all the problems in the world that way, and that's what they try to do. And Eisenhower himself, before he gave that speech, sitting with his advisors in the Oval Office, he said, God help this country when someone sits in this chair who does not understand the military the way I do. And of course that would apply to every president since then. And all of his warnings, it's always worth going back and reading that speech by Eisenhower, and also the speech he gave at the beginning of his presidency in 1953, what's called the Cross of Iron speech. And he said, this is not really a way to live. This is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. And so, yeah, his warnings were absolutely eloquent and prescient, but it is that combination that he talked about, the conjunction of those two things, that gives it such, as he said, unwarranted influence. Yeah.
Well, I'm the optimist because I have to be to be an activist. I look at things like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the United Nations and see that was built up from the grassroots, from a global call by people around the world saying, you're insane with all your nuclear weapons. We've got to ban them from the face of the earth. And enough countries have ratified it. It's actually the law of the land. What we have to do now, of course, is to get the nuclear countries to agree to that. But there is that momentum. And when it comes to what's happening around the world, I mean, you could look at Latin America and see the excitement there of progressive governments coming into power, deciding that they're going to reduce their militaries and put the money into ending poverty and things that are good for the people. And we are living now in a multipolar world that the U.S. doesn't want to admit exists, but it does. And the Ukraine war is speeding that up, so that alternatives to the U.S. and the U.S. policies of militarizing foreign policy and the undue economic sanctions that the U.S. imposes around the world is speeding up that transition. And that transition, like the increase in a coalition called the BRICS, and there's about 20 more countries now that want to join the BRICS, and they're doing their bilateral trade not in US dollars but in their own local currencies. This is actually a good thing for the evolution of the world.
Okay, well, this has been wonderful. Any final words, final thoughts? One more question?
Sure.
All right, then we're gonna wrap.
So I have a problem with putting our strategies mostly around trying to influence people who are in office. I think, well, that should be part of it. I don't think we should gear everything or even most things in that direction. I think now that ROTC is now being pushed into high schools all over, that's an opening for us to organize with younger people to oppose the ROTCs in their schools, which will then nationally take over and expand beyond that. The important thing is that people form organizations, affinity groups, small groups, in their schools that can then mushroom out on their own that we could support. I'm not sure what other openings we might have, but I think we need to look for them and not really mostly focus on how people vote in Congress as our main strategy. That will come after we are in the streets or in doing other things. So if people have any ideas of where other targets can be, that would be helpful.
Well, if you join the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, or you just look on the website, you'll see a whole host of things that people can do. We did an 18-minute video that we have made available free for the public that you can show, and there are people who are going back to the old ideas of doing house parties, and they're showing it at universities. You can find it on the CODEPINK website as well as in Peace in Ukraine. There are groups that are going out to their farmers markets every week and with a sign that says, "Let's talk about Ukraine." And they're engaging in discussions and getting people to sign on to petitions calling for a ceasefire. We have media committees that are trying to get people with different opinions into the media, trying to get their op-eds published. We have our media person, where's Melissa here? Right back there. Let's give her a hand. She's doing great work trying to get, as well as Sam here at our books, trying to get us into the media. We have, we believe that we need to do all kinds of things, and probably the most important right now is education, education, education. But as we educate people, we have to get them mobilized, and it might be 10 people on a street corner or 2 people at a farmer's market, and hopefully it will be thousands of people January 14th here in New York City and other places. But I think we all agree that we have to use all of those different tactics as a way of being visible, as a way of energizing people, and as a way of showing the people in Congress that there is a growing base for this. Because when those Republicans who voted against the $40 billion were asked why, they said, because we are hearing from our base.
Any final words? No? All right, well, thank you so much.
Buy lots of books, give them to your relatives.
They're great. It's a great book, a very quick read. And thank you so much to Or Books. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Summer. And thank you for the people videotaping. And we will see you at the next event. Oh, and they're signing books. Okay, I'm glad I told this. All right, they're signing books in here or in the back? In the back. So make sure you get your book signed.
What's the next event?
I don't know, Colin. What's the next event?
Here?
TBD. Surprise. Yeah.
But a great space.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was always